Let's get this coolant overflow out of our way. 10mm socket, remove this bolt. Lift this up, slide it out of the cowl, and just flip it to the side over here. Over here by the overflow, you can disconnect this hose, and then right here, there's a clamp. You'll have to disconnect this one as well. Lift up on the tab, pop it open. Remove this hose. Now you can tilt the overflow in a way in which it won't leak through either hose connections. Then move this out of your way. Next, unplug the mass airflow sensor connector. Right over there, you'll see a hose clamp. We'll have to remove that with either an 8mm or a flathead screwdriver. Loosen up this clamp. And at the front right here, you'll see two 10mm bolts that hold on this air intake. Remove both. Pull up on this and slide it out of the air intake over here. There we go, set this aside. Let's remove this harness for the mass airflow sensor off of the shroud. Set that aside. Pop this one off too. Follow it along to the driver's side. Remove it off of here as well. And thankfully there's a lot of slack in this harness. Looks like it has some extra wires here. But just push this to the side like this. I'm going to use a bungee cord to support it out of my way. Pull this hose out of the shroud. Let's remove the rest of this intake duct from over there on the throttle body. Use a flathead screwdriver and loosen up this clamp. Then we'll pull this right off. That'll just make some extra space here. That way we can pull the radiator fan shroud out of the way. Slide this off. Set that aside. Push this AC hose off of the shroud. Straight back like that. Let's unclip the radiator hose. Use a trim tool and pop it up. Push this out of the way. Now if you follow the filler tube and the dipstick tubes, there are a couple bolts here that we have to take out. The first one being this one right here for the oil dipstick tube, 10mm socket. Take that out. Now this can move around a little bit. Try not to bend it too much out of the way. The next one that we have to remove is that nut over there. So it holds the transmission dipstick tube in. Drop a 10mm socket on there and then try to break it free. One last one to be removed is that 13mm bolt down there on that bracket, and that holds the oil filler tube. I'm going to stick my socket with an extension down in here. It's a 13mm socket, and I'm going to try and remove this one. Get that bolt out. Now we can move all of these around as we need. Okay, I'm going to separate these two. That way they can move independently of each other. And now hopefully we can get the fan shroud out. The radiator fan shroud is held on by these two 10mm bolts here. And then there are some that go straight down, two on each side. I'll show you those in a second. For now, let's get these two off. And the bolts I'm talking about, there are actually three on each side. My passenger side only has two, but there's one at the back there, one in the middle, and one right at the front here. They're all 10mm bolts, so with a long extension, I'll get those. And on this side, like I said, I have one missing, but there's still one at the front. So let's take all of them out. It's going to be really hard to show you, but I'll try my best. Take out these three bolts on the driver's side. Do the same to the passenger side. Now you can take this fan shroud, pop it back and off of the radiator. Now we just have to fish it out of here. Push the dipstick tubes out of your way. Get it past this radiator hose. Slide it up and out. There we go. Next, we'll have to take off the fan and the fan clutch. There's a 36mm nut back here. Really hard to see, but I can show you once this is off, and you'll need a fan clutch tool to do this. What that is, it's basically a wrench looking thing like this and an adapter for your air chisel or air hammer. You put the attachment on that nut. You put those two together. All right, and with your tool on here, give it a couple taps with the air hammer. It should break this fan clutch free. Finally broke free. Now go ahead and unthread it When it comes off, make sure you hold it so it doesn't hit your radiator. And remove the fan with the fan clutch. So this right here is the nut that I was aiming for with my tool. Put the tool in it and you spin it counterclockwise, regular thread, it's not reverse thread. Then you can take this whole assembly off. We have to take the belt off next, and this right here is your tensioner. So grab a 15mm socket on a ratchet or a breaker bar or a serpentine belt tensioner tool. Take tension off, remove the belt off of the pulleys, let go, and take the belt off completely. Take note of the routing of the belt. I can show you later in the video, of course, but it's always a good idea to remember how it's routed. Now we can remove the power steering pulley. You need a special power steering pulley puller. I'm sure you can do it other ways, but this is the best way that you're gonna be able to do it. Slide the special tool on here, and then with, for me, a 13mm socket, but of course for you it might be different. Go ahead and tighten the puller and it'll pull the pulley off. Just make sure you note how far the pulley stayed in. It should bottom out at the end, but that way you have a good reference of how far it was pressed on originally. There it goes. And you can release your tool. And there's your pulley. I'm going to take a rag with some brake parts cleaner on it and clean up the shaft of the power steering pump here. Make sure it is free of any debris. This has to be a very clean surface. Like I said, it's a perfectly machined, pressed fit. Otherwise, your pulley's going to spin and it'll slip on the shaft. So now that this is clean, let's get ready for installation. There are threads in here, and those are going to have to get cleaned up most likely because a lot of times water gets in there and it rusts them out, and you need those threads to thread in a bolt with the special tool to press on the new pulley. So let's go ahead and clean those up. So I sprayed the threads with some rust penetrant. As you can see, this wants to slide on. All right, this is threaded on. Take the outer insert off, slide the new pulley on, thread this back on. Then what you're gonna do is hold the center shaft with an 11mm socket, or whatever your tool requires. And then with a wrench, you're gonna go ahead and tighten this, and that's gonna push the pulley onto the power steering pump. I'm gonna check where I'm at. Oh yeah, quite a bit left to go. All right, let's check where we're at. Looks like we still have a little bit more to go. As you can see, the shaft of the power steering pump is not visible yet, so a little bit more to go. Oh, that bottomed out. So let's see where we're at now. I'll go ahead and take my tool off of here. So let's get the belt on. Here's a diagram of what the routing should be. I'm gonna start at the tensioner, and I'm gonna go under the crank pulley first, the harmonic balancer, after the tensioner. Make sure it's sitting in all the ribs that it needs to. And from the harmonic balancer, I'm gonna go over the water pump. Okay, try to hold it here, and then go underneath the power steering, over the alternator, and lastly underneath this idler. But in order to do that, we have to release tension. So we can slip it under here, let go of the tensioner, and now double check that the belt is seated properly all over, which it is, so that is perfect. Next, we have to get the fan in, slide it over the water pump, and thread it on. The threads should start easily. If they don't, it's probably because it's not lined up. Sometimes it's hard to line it up because you have to get it at the perfect angle, and thread it on until it bottoms out, which it just did. So now we'll get our air chisel with the fan tool and snug it up. Of course, now we'll go in the opposite direction that we did when loosening. Okay, that should do it. Let's get the fan shroud back in, push the dipsticks out of the way. Pay attention to your radiator fins to make sure you don't damage them as you install the fan shroud. Get all the hoses and wires and cables and everything that's supposed to be out of the way. Just get it out of the way. Now with the fan shroud in place, I'm actually not going to bolt it up to the top yet. Make sure these rubber pieces on the top lock into the radiator. That's what's going to hold it tight. And then I'm actually going to start in the bolts that connect the two halves first. There's 3 of them, if you remember correctly. There are 6 of them, 3 on each side. Kind of hard to see. Start them all on by hand. You don't want them to cross thread by accident. And now I'm going to just snug them up. 10mm socket. Okay, let's do the same to the other side. All right, all 6 are tight. Put this AC line right back where it belongs. Make sure it's out of the way of everything. Reconnect or resecure the upper radiator hose. Before we go too far, let's put this in. Make sure it's seated all the way down. Let's snug up the hose clamp. I'm using an 8mm socket. You can use that or a flathead, whatever you prefer. Just make sure it's nice and snug, but don't over tighten it. Those usually strip out and you have to replace them if you over tighten them. Before we move any further, let's resecure the fan shroud and therefore also the radiator. These 2 10mm bolts, or one right here and one right here. Snug these up. Resecure any wires. Now take your air intake and let's line it up. Make sure it slides in over here and makes a nice tight connection. Once it's in, snug up the hose clamp so that it can be secured. At the front here, there were 2 mounting bolts. Line those up and start them in. Go ahead and plug in the mass airflow sensor connector. Make sure it clicks so it's nice and secure. This is going to be kind of hard to see, but I need to put the dipstick tubes back together, which means the transmission dipstick needs to actually go over the stud of the oil filled tube. So I unlodged the oil filler tube from the valve cover, and you want to make sure if you do this, try to get no debris in there. And that allows you to twist it in such a way. In which you can hopefully get this stud underneath. Not sure why they didn't make it a bolt, but either way, there we go. Now those are put back together, so you can put the filler tube back in its slot. Grommet in the valve cover, so there we go. I pressed that back in. Grommet's still in. Dipstick or fill tube is down into the valve cover. Let's bolt it down. This one's not going to be easy. Let's bolt this down here. All right, let's snug it up with a 13mm socket. There we go. That's nice and snug. Up here, let's put a little 10mm nut on. Snug this up. Over here, let's reattach the dipstick tube with our little 10mm bolt. Make sure this is nice and snug. Take the coolant overflow. The hose that comes out the bottom here will go to the radiator. Slide it into the 2 slots up there. Push it all the way back. Set it down. And I'm just going to go ahead and start in the bolt. That way it stays in place here. I'll snug it up in a second. I'm going to connect the hose to the radiator. Connect this hose to the top fitting on the radiator and squeeze the hose clamp shut. If your hose clamp isn't good anymore, go ahead and replace it. Squeeze the hose clamp to lock it tight. Snug up the overflow bolt. And this fitting right here was attached to this breather hose just in case it overflows or it needs to take up some air. Then this goes straight down.